In the unforgiving landscape of 1880s Texas, where the sun beats down mercilessly on cracked earth and hope seems as scarce as water, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. What would you do if your most loyal companion led you to a discovery that could change not just your life, but the fate of an entire community? This is the story of Samuel Hayes, a struggling farmer whose world was turned upside down by the persistent barking of his dog and a secret buried deep in an abandoned oil well. If you're ready to discover how one man's courage in the face of powerful enemies changed everything, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this remind us that sometimes the smallest voices can echo the loudest truths. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hayes farm as Samuel wiped the sweat from his weathered brow. At 42, he looked older than his years. The Texas drought had been merciless, and his once fertile land now resembled a moonscape of cracked earth and withered crops. His wife, Martha, had taken their 2 children to stay with her sister in Austin 3 months ago, promising to return when things got better. Samuel wasn't sure they ever would. The farm that had been in his family for 3 generations was dying. His grandfather had built the original homestead with his bare hands, clearing mesquite and fighting off Comanche raids. His father had expanded it, adding the barn and the well that had sustained them through previous droughts. Now Samuel watched helplessly as everything his family had built crumbled like the parched earth beneath his feet. The bank letters had become more frequent and more threatening. James Morrison, the bank president, had been sympathetic at first, but his tone had grown cold in recent weeks. "Times are hard for everyone, Samuel," he'd said during their last meeting. "But business is business. We can't carry bad debts forever." Samuel had sold everything he could. The prize bull his father had been so proud of, Martha's grandmother's china, even his father's gold pocket watch. But it wasn't enough. The mortgage payment was 3 months overdue, and foreclosure loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon. "Come on, Rusty," he called to his red-coated mutt, who had been his only companion since the family left. "Let's check the north fence before this heat gets any worse." Rusty had been astray when he'd wandered onto the farm 2 years ago, half-starved and covered in burrs. Martha had wanted to take him to town, but Samuel had seen something in the dog's intelligent amber eyes, a loyalty that reminded him of his own connection to the land. Now, with his family gone, Rusty was more than a pet. He was Samuel's lifeline to sanity, but Rusty wasn't interested in fence repairs. The dog had been acting strange for days, pacing, whining, and constantly looking toward the old Blackwood property that bordered Samuel's land to the east. The abandoned oil well there had been dry for over a decade, ever since Old Man Blackwood died and his son sold the mineral rights to the Cromwell Oil Company before disappearing into the night. Samuel remembered Ezra Blackwood well, a cantankerous old coot who'd been convinced there was still oil in his well long after everyone else had given up. He'd spent his final years ranting about conspiracies and cover-ups, claims that had earned him a reputation as the town eccentric. When he died in what the sheriff called an unfortunate accident, a fall down his own front steps, most folks had just shaken their heads and moved on. As Samuel gathered his tools, Rusty began barking insistently, running a few steps toward the Blackwood property, then returning to Samuel, then repeating the process. The dog's behavior was becoming increasingly frantic, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an urgency that Samuel had never witnessed. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Samuel muttered, but the dog's behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. Rusty grabbed Samuel's worn leather glove in his teeth and began pulling with surprising strength. The dog's amber eyes held an urgency that Samuel had never seen before, not even during the worst storms or when coyotes threatened their small flock of chickens. All right, Samuel conceded, setting down his hammer. "Show me what's got you so worked up." The dog immediately bounded toward the property line, stopping every few yards to ensure Samuel was following. They crossed through a gap in the old fence and onto land that had been untouched for years. Mesquite and prickly pear had reclaimed much of the area, but Rusty navigated through the overgrowth with purpose, as if following a scent trail invisible to human senses. The Blackwood property told a story of abandonment and decay. The old farmhouse stood like a skeleton against the sky, its windows broken and roof partially collapsed. Tumbleweeds had gathered against the porch, and the windmill that had once pumped water for the household stood motionless, its blades twisted and broken. 20 minutes later, they stood before the abandoned oil derrick, a skeletal tower of rusted metal that creaked ominously in the wind. The well itself was covered by a heavy wooden platform, secured with a rusty chain and an old padlock that had long since seized with age. Weeds grew up through the gaps in the planking, and the entire structure looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Rusty began digging frantically at the base of the platform, his claws scraping against the sun-baked wood. Dirt flew in all directions as he worked with desperate intensity. Then he stopped, sat back on his haunches, and began to howl, a long, mournful sound that sent chills down Samuel's spine despite the oppressive heat. "What is it, boy? What do you smell down there?" Samuel knelt beside the platform and pressed his ear to the wood. At first, he heard nothing but the wind through the derrick and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then faintly, he detected something that made his blood run cold, a weak, rhythmic tapping coming from deep within the well. Someone was down there. Someone was alive. The realization hit him like a physical blow. How long had someone been trapped down there? Days, weeks, and why hadn't anyone heard them before? The Blackwood property was isolated, but surely someone should have noticed something. Samuel's mind raced as he examined the platform more closely. The wood was weathered but solid, and the chain securing it was thick and heavy. This wasn't just a safety measure. It was designed to keep people out, or he realized with growing horror, to keep someone in. Samuel's hands shook as he examined the padlock. The metal was corroded but still solid. He ran back to his farm and returned with a crowbar and rope, his mind racing with possibilities. Who could be down there? How long had they been trapped? And why hadn't anyone heard them before? The run back to his farm and the return trip took nearly an hour, and with each passing minute Samuel's anxiety grew. What if whoever was down there didn't have much time left? What if he was already too late? He'd also grabbed a lantern, some water and basic medical supplies. If someone had been trapped for days, they'd need immediate care. The thought of what condition they might be in made his stomach churn. Rusty had remained at the well site, pacing anxiously around the platform and occasionally letting out sharp barks directed downward. When Samuel returned, the dog's relief was palpable. He ran to Samuel, then back to the platform, as if urging him to hurry. The padlock gave way with a sharp crack, and Samuel heaved the heavy wooden platform aside. The smell that rose from the well was overwhelming, a mixture of stagnant water, decay, and something else he couldn't identify. It was the smell of desperation and fear, of someone who had been trapped in darkness for far too long. He peered into the darkness, but could see nothing beyond the first few feet. The well shaft disappeared into blackness, and the silence was deafening. "Hello," he called down. "Can you hear me?" The tapping stopped. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a weak voice drifted up from the depths. "Help, please. Been here days." The voice was hoarse and barely audible, but it was definitely human. Samuel's heart pounded as he realized the magnitude of what he was dealing with. Someone had been deliberately trapped down there, left to die in the darkness. "Hold on," Samuel shouted down. "I'm coming to get you." He secured his rope to the derrick and tested its strength. The old metal groaned but held firm. Samuel lit his lantern and began his descent, using the old iron rungs that had been built into the well's walls. Rusty whined anxiously at the surface, pacing back and forth. The well was deeper than Samuel had expected, at least 40 feet. As he descended, the air grew cooler and more humid. The walls were slick with moisture, and more than once his boots slipped on the rusty rungs. About halfway down, his boots touched water. The bottom of the well was flooded with about 3 feet of murky liquid that smelled of oil and decay. In the dim light of his lantern, Samuel could make out a figure huddled on a narrow ledge just above the waterline. It was a young man, maybe 25, with dark hair and clothes that marked him as a city dweller rather than a local rancher. His face was gaunt with dehydration, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. "Thank God," the man whispered, his voice hoarse. I thought I was going to die down here." "Easy there," Samuel said, making his way carefully toward the ledge. The water was deeper than it had appeared from above, reaching nearly to his waist. "I'm Samuel Hayes. What's your name, son?" "Thomas. Thomas Blackwood," the man replied, and Samuel's blood turned to ice. "Blackwood? As in, Old Man Blackwood was my grandfather," Thomas confirmed. "I came back to investigate some things, but someone didn't want me poking around." Samuel helped Thomas to his feet, noting the young man's obvious dehydration and the nasty gash on his forehead. There were also rope burns on his wrists and what looked like bruises around his throat. Someone had worked him over pretty thoroughly before throwing him down here. "Someone did this to you." "Threw you down here?" Thomas nodded weakly. "3 men. Said I should have stayed away. Said some secrets are better left buried." He gestured toward a leather satchel that had somehow remained dry on the ledge. "But I found what I was looking for first. How long have you been down here?" 4 days, I think. Maybe 5. Hard to tell without sunlight." Thomas's voice was getting stronger, but Samuel could see the toll the ordeal had taken. "I've been rationing the water I had in my canteen, but it ran out yesterday. I was starting to think—" "Don't think about that now," Samuel said firmly. "We need to get you out of here and get some food and water in you." Getting Thomas up the well proved to be a challenge. The young man was weak from his ordeal, and the rope was barely long enough to reach the bottom. Samuel had to essentially carry Thomas on his back for the first part of the climb, using the iron rungs with one hand while supporting the injured man with the other. Rusty's excited barking greeted them as they emerged into the blazing Texas sun. Thomas collapsed on the ground, gasping and shielding his eyes from the light. Samuel gave him small sips of water from his canteen, knowing that too much too fast could make him sick. "What's in the bag?" Samuel asked once Thomas had recovered enough to sit up. "Evidence," Thomas said grimly. "Evidence that the Cromwell Oil Company has been lying to this entire community for over 10 years. Back at Samuel's farmhouse, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee warming his hands, while Samuel tended to the cut on his head. The young man had insisted on cleaning up and eating something before explaining what had happened, and Samuel had been patient, recognizing that Thomas needed time to process his ordeal. Rusty lay at Thomas's feet, as if sensing the young man needed protection. The dog had barely left Thomas's side since they'd returned to the farm, and Samuel noticed that Thomas seemed to draw comfort from the animal's presence. "My grandfather never sold those mineral rights willingly," Thomas began, his voice growing stronger with each sip of coffee. "He was forced into it, threatened, and when he tried to fight back they made sure he had an accident." Samuel set down the medical supplies and took a seat across from Thomas. "That's a serious accusation, son." "I have proof." Thomas opened the leather satchel and pulled out a stack of yellow documents. Letters, contracts, even a confession my grandfather wrote before he died. The Cromwell Oil Company knew there was still oil in that well, lots of it. But they also knew that if they extracted it properly, they'd have to share the profits with the local landowners, according to the original agreements. Samuel examined the papers, his anger building with each page. The documents told a story of systematic fraud and intimidation that went back more than a decade. There were threatening letters, forged contracts, and what appeared to be evidence of bribery involving local officials. So they declared the well dry and bought up the mineral rights for pennies on the dollar. Exactly. And they've been secretly extracting oil for years, selling it through shell companies and keeping all the profits. Money that should have gone to your community. Money that could have saved farms like yours. Thomas pulled out a final document. a geological survey that made Samuel's eyes widen. According to the technical language he could barely understand, there was enough oil under this area to make every landowner within 5 miles wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. According to this, there's enough oil under this area to make every landowner within 5 miles wealthy. The drought, the failed crops, families leaving, none of it had to happen. Samuel felt a rage building inside him that he'd never experienced before. All the suffering, all the families torn apart, all the dreams destroyed, it had all been unnecessary. The Cromwell Oil Company had deliberately impoverished an entire community for their own profit. But why come back now? Samuel asked. Why risk your life for this? Thomas's expression hardened. Because I found out they're planning to expand. They want to buy up all the remaining land for nothing, claim it's worthless, then extract millions in oil. Your farm is next on their list, Mr. Hayes. They've already started the paperwork to foreclose on your mortgage. Samuel felt the room spin. His mortgage was indeed behind, but he'd been working with the bank on a payment plan. Morrison had seemed understanding, even sympathetic. How do you know about my mortgage? Because the bank president, James Morrison, is Cromwell's silent partner. They've been manipulating the local economy for years, making sure farmers fail so they can buy the land cheap. The pieces began falling into place in Samuel's mind. Morrison's sudden change in attitude, the impossible terms of the payment plan, the way other farmers in the area had been foreclosed on despite having valuable land. It had all been orchestrated. My grandfather figured it out too late, Thomas continued. He tried to fight them, tried to expose what they were doing. That's when they killed him. You're sure it wasn't an accident? Thomas pulled out another document, a letter in shaky handwriting. He wrote this the night before he died. He knew they were coming for him. He hid these papers in a secret compartment in his house, along with instructions for me to find them if anything happened to him. Samuel read the letter, his hands trembling with anger. Ezra Blackwood had known he was going to die, and he'd spent his final hours documenting the truth for future generations. Why didn't you go to the authorities first? I tried. Sheriff Morrison is James Morrison's brother. Judge Patterson owes his position to Cromwell family influence. I realized I needed more evidence, something that would force the federal authorities to get involved. Thomas pulled out a small notebook filled with dates, times, and detailed observations. I've been watching their operation for weeks. They've been extracting oil at night, using hidden access roads. I documented everything, truck movements, personnel, even took some photographs. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Samuel peered through the window and saw 3 riders approaching, hard-looking men in expensive suits, completely out of place in the rural setting. They found me, Thomas whispered, his face pale. Those are the same men who threw me in the well. Samuel grabbed his shotgun from above the fireplace. Not in my house, they won't. The lead rider dismounted and approached the porch with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He was tall and lean, with cold grey eyes and a perfectly waxed mustache. His expensive suit was immaculate despite the dusty ride, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. His companions remained mounted, hands resting casually on their gun. Belts, professional gunmen who'd clearly done this kind of work before. Mr. Hayes, the man called out in a smooth voice that carried the cultured accent of Eastern education. I'm William Cromwell, Jr., representing Cromwell Oil Company. I believe you have something that belongs to us. Samuel stepped onto the porch, shotgun cradled in his arms. Up close, he could see that Cromwell was younger than he'd first appeared, probably in his early 30s, with the soft hands of a man who'd never done manual labor. But his eyes held a coldness that spoke of ruthless ambition. This is private property. Mr. Cromwell, you're not welcome here. Cromwell's smile never wavered. But Samuel noticed his companions shifting in their saddles. Now, Mr. Hayes, let's be reasonable. We know young Mr. Blackwood is inside, and we know he's taken some documents that don't belong to him. Return them, and we can all walk away from this unpleasantness. The only unpleasantness I see is you threatening an honest farmer on his own land, Samuel replied. Those documents prove what you've been doing to this community. The stealing, the lying, the manipulation. Prove. Cromwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. To whom? Sheriff Morrison is my cousin, and Judge Patterson owes his position to my family's influence. Who exactly do you think will believe the word of a failing farmer and a trespassing city boy against the Cromwell name? The casual way Cromwell admitted to corruption made Samuel's blood boil. This man saw the local community as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard, to be moved and sacrificed at will. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind Samuel, the leather satchel clutched tightly in his hands. Despite his ordeal, he stood straight and met Cromwell's gaze without flinching. Maybe the federal marshals will be interested, he said, or the newspapers in Austin and Dallas. I've already sent copies of these documents to both. For the first time, Cromwell's composure cracked. His smile faltered, and Samuel saw a flash of genuine concern in his eyes. You're bluffing, am I? Thomas stepped forward, and Samuel was impressed by the young man's courage. I may be young, Mr. Cromwell, but I'm not stupid. I knew coming here was dangerous, so I took precautions. If anything happens to me or Mr. Hayes, those documents will be published in every major newspaper in Texas within a week. Thomas pulled out a telegram receipt from his pocket. I sent copies to my lawyer in Austin yesterday, with instructions to release everything to the press if I don't check in within 7 days. That gives me 3 days to resolve this situation. One of Cromwell's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. The man was scarred and weathered, with the look of someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. Rusty, who had been silent until now, emerged from behind the house and began growling low in his throat. The dog's hackles were raised, and his amber eyes were fixed on the mounted gunman. Samuel had never seen Rusty react so aggressively to anyone. I wouldn't, Samuel said quietly, raising his shotgun slightly. My dog's got a good sense for character, and he doesn't like what he sees. The tension stretched taut as the two groups faced each other. Samuel could feel sweat running down his back, despite the evening coolness, and his finger rested lightly on the shotgun's trigger. Cromwell studied the situation for a long moment, his calculating mind weighing options. Finally, he remounted his horse, but his expression had turned venomous. This isn't over. Hayes, you're already behind on your mortgage, and when the bank forecloses next month, we'll own this land anyway. Then we'll see how brave you feel. Actually, Thomas said, pulling another document from the satchel, you might want to read this first. He held up a legal paper that made Cromwell's face go white. It's a copy of my grandfather's original will, the real one, not the forgery you filed with the county. It turns out he left the mineral rights to the entire Blackwood property to the local farmers' cooperative, with the stipulation that any oil profits be shared equally among all landowners in the area. Samuel stared at Thomas in amazement. I mean every farmer within 5 miles of here is about to become very wealthy. Mr. Hayes and Mr. Cromwell's company is about to face some very serious federal charges for fraud and theft. The implications hit Samuel like a thunderbolt. Not only would he be able to save his farm, but every struggling family in the area would finally have the prosperity they deserved. Cromwell's horse pranced nervously as its rider's hands tightened on the reins. You have no idea what you're dealing with, boy. My family has connections you can't imagine. So did my grandfather, Thomas replied calmly. But the truth has a way of coming out eventually, and sometimes it takes a loyal dog and a good man to make sure it sees the light of day. Cromwell's mask of civility finally slipped completely. You think this is over? You think some old papers and newspaper stories will stop us? We've been building this empire for decades, and we're not going to let some farm boy and his mutt destroy it. Maybe not, Samuel said, stepping forward. But you're going to have to go through me first. And I've got neighbors who feel the same way. As if summoned by his words, the sound of more horses could be heard in the distance. Samuel smiled grimly as he recognized the riders, Jake Morrison, no relation to the banker, Pete Williams, and several other local farmers who'd heard about the confrontation and come to help. Cromwell realized he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. With a final venomous look, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled, then spurred his mount toward the road, his gunmen following close behind. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Thomas's lawyer arrived from Austin with federal marshals in tow, and the investigation into Cromwell Oil Company's activities began in earnest. The evidence Thomas had gathered, combined with the documents from his grandfather's hidden cache, painted a picture of systematic fraud that stretched back over a decade. Samuel found himself at the center of a media storm as reporters from across Texas descended on the small community to cover the story. The tale of the loyal dog who'd led his master to uncover a massive conspiracy captured the public imagination, and Rusty became something of a celebrity. But the real vindication came when the federal investigators began excavating the Cromwell Oil Company's hidden operations. They found exactly what Thomas had documented: a sophisticated network of illegal extraction sites, hidden pipelines, and shell companies designed to conceal millions of dollars in stolen oil. The geological surveys proved accurate as well. When legitimate oil companies were brought in to assess the area, they confirmed that the region sat on one of the largest untapped oil reserves in Texas. The Blackwood property alone was worth millions, and the surrounding farmland was equally valuable. James Morrison was arrested for fraud and conspiracy, and Judge Patterson was removed from the bench pending investigation. Sheriff Morrison resigned in disgrace when his connection to the conspiracy was revealed. The entire corrupt network that had kept the community impoverished began to crumble. William Cromwell Jr. fled to Mexico before he could be arrested, but his company's assets were frozen and eventually distributed to the defrauded landowners. The Cromwell family's empire, built on decades of theft and corruption, collapsed virtually overnight. 6 months later, Samuel stood in the same spot where Rusty had first led him to the abandoned well. But everything had changed. The old derrick had been replaced with modern equipment, and the sound of productive drilling filled the air. The Cromwell Oil Company was facing federal charges, and their assets had been frozen pending investigation. Martha and the children had returned home, and the farmhouse was alive with laughter again. The oil profits were already flowing to the local farmers' cooperative, and the entire community was experiencing a renaissance. New businesses were opening, families were returning, and hope had replaced desperation. The Hayes farm was thriving again. With his share of the oil profits, Samuel had been able to modernize his equipment, drill new wells, and even hire additional help. His children were attending a new school that had been built with oil money, and Martha was pregnant with their 4th child. Thomas Blackwood had decided to stay in the area, using his inheritance to establish a legal aid office for rural communities. He and Samuel had become close friends, bonded by their shared experience and commitment to justice. Thomas had also started a foundation in his grandfather's name, dedicated to fighting corporate corruption in rural areas. "You know," Thomas said, joining Samuel at the well site, "I never properly thanked Rusty for saving my life." Samuel chuckled and patted the red dog, who was contentedly chasing grasshoppers in the nearby field. Rusty had become something of a local legend, and visitors often came just to meet the dog, who'd helped expose one of the biggest corporate scandals in Texas history. "I think he knows. Dogs have a way of understanding these things. What made him so persistent that day? How did he know you were down there?" Thomas smiled. "I'd like to think it was my grandfather's spirit guiding him to the truth. But honestly, I think it was simpler than that. I think Rusty just knew that sometimes, when good people are in trouble, other good people need to step up and help." Samuel nodded, watching his wife hang laundry on the line while their children played in the yard. The sight filled him with a contentment he'd thought he'd never feel again. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change everything, and sometimes, Thomas added, the most loyal hearts can see what human eyes miss entirely. The community had erected a small monument at the site of the old well, commemorating not just the discovery of oil, but the triumph of truth over corruption. The inscription read, "In memory of Ezra Blackwood, who died seeking justice, and in honor of all those who refused to let the truth stay buried." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the sound of productive oil wells mixed with the laughter of children and the contented barking of a red dog who had helped save an entire community. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but for the first time in years, they promised rain instead of despair. Samuel reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Rusty had first started acting strange. The dog's persistence had seemed like nothing more than animal restlessness, but it had led to the salvation of an entire community. Sometimes, Samuel thought, the most important messages come from the most unexpected messengers. The oil money had transformed more than just individual lives. It had restored the community's faith in justice and the power of ordinary people to stand up against corruption. Children who might have grown up in poverty were now assured of good educations and bright futures. Families that had been torn apart by economic hardship were reunited and stronger than ever. And at the center of it all was a red dog whose loyalty and instincts had changed the course of history. Rusty had become a symbol of hope for the entire region, proof that sometimes the smallest among us can accomplish the greatest things. This story reminds us that courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the most unlikely heroes can change the course of history. If you enjoyed this tale of loyalty, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the American frontier. Hit that like button if Rusty's loyalty touched your heart, and let us know in the comments what you think makes a true hero. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in the ground, but in the bonds between those who refuse to give up on each other.